Hello, everyone. Welcome to Laser Focus. This is the deep dive pop culture podcast from Nerdist. I'm Kyle Anderson. Thank you so much for listening. Folks, this week we are just about at the end of our spooky month. And one of the things that people have often asked me about my love of horror movies is like, what about horror movies that are not quite as dark? Do you like those? And the answer is, yeah, kind of, depending on the movie. And so to talk about horror comedies and specifically what that means for everyone involved, I'm joined once again by perennial guest of the show, my friend and yours, Michael Walsh. Hey, Mikey, how are you?
Hey, Kyle, thanks for having me back. Always very glad to be here.
Yeah, if you're not on once a month, there's an issue.
I actually was thinking about it. I don't think I was on once last October because we have so many horror experts.
Right.
But we're not doing horror. We're doing horror comedy. So
Yeah.
that's where I shine.
Yeah, so basically there's been some discrepancy. Mikey's writing a couple of lists, which by this point are up on the site already, presumably. One is a list of horror comedies that are more scary than funny, and one is a list of horror comedies that are more funny than scary. And that alone sparked quite a bit of discussion amongst us and the rest of the Nerdist staff, which is like, what actually constitutes a horror comedy versus just a horror movie that has funny elements or a comedy that has horror elements. And that's sort of what we're going to talk about today is like, what even is one? And then we'll talk about some of the ones that we think are the best in the various types of horror comedies. But it's such an interesting, a lot of people have often said that horror and comedy are basically like the two ends of the spectrum in terms of like visceral reactions to things. Like people either find something like incredibly funny and you can't help but laugh, or you find something incredibly like horrifying and revolting and you can't help but like cringe and hide your eyes and stuff like that. And so the horror comedy kind of like loops that around so that they're touching. And I definitely have a preferred type of horror comedy, more so than the other one, but we will we'll get all the way into it. So at what point, because I feel like we both grew up in the 80s and 90s, and that was sort of the heyday, in my opinion, of horror comedies. And there were like silly horror movies in the 60s, kind of spoofy horror movies, or like just out and out comedies that had horror stuff in it. Not unlike, like the Addams Family and the Munsters, for example, like were TV shows that were horror themes, but were just straight up sitcoms. But in the 80s, I think there was a little bit more in the way of like, I don't know. I feel like everyone was sort of more cynical in the 80s and then into the 90s. And that's when you get a lot of like really gory movies that are played for laughs, which is at the same time you have really gory movies that are like action movies and stuff too. So,
well, I was actually thinking about that because that's kind of when I think we really see the rise of horror franchises, which just they just start pumping them out, right? Like if you have a horror movie that lands, they're cheap to make. They make a lot of money. They just sell themselves. So the studios start pumping them out. But basically every horror franchise, the longer it goes, the more it just leans into comedy. Sort of become, if not straight up parodies of themselves, very kind of self-aware and goofy. And that's how you end up with something like Jason X, a movie that I love, that I want to talk about whether or not it actually qualifies. But, it's like the Nightmare on Elm Street films. They just get straight funny, but they always, for the most part, feel like horror movies with a lot of comedy, not horror comedies. And I think that the generation kind of we grew up in, it just kind of became like horror and comedy. Like you said, they really did kind of just connect. So even if we weren't watching horror comedies, the idea of laughing during a horror movie was something that was just normal. It became the norm for a lot of them. And of course, all these horror franchises they lean into comedy as far as they can, and then they go all the way back to horror, usually with some really bad remake or something like that. So it will go all the way back to the start.
Yeah, it's a fascinating cycle, because you're absolutely right, and especially in the 80s when the horror icon became the star on these franchises, and Jason and Freddy are two great examples where people wanted to just see Jason kill people horribly. People just wanted to see Freddy like do these elaborate kind of dream-based kills of people while quipping and things like that. And the more silly they became, or the more kind of grandiose they became, the more we loved them. And I Jason X is a good example because that is a very silly movie. I also enjoy Jason X. I think it's fun. But they actually started that franchise started doing that with. I think it's now considered like a great one, but I think at the time horror purists were like, "What is this? This is stupid." Which is Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, which is the first one where he becomes a zombie. Like before that, he was just a guy. And then in the fifth one, he's not even there. Spoilers, it's a copycat. And so then he rises from the dead. And that one even starts like, there's the opening scene where he like gets struck by lightning, his body gets struck by lightning and all this stuff. And then like it does the James Bond, like walking in front of, like across the camera with the circle around, like the barrel. And then instead of turning and shooting, he turns and like slashes. And like it's just a silly movie, but and the kills are very funny and dumb, and like I think it's a blast. I really enjoy. That's maybe my favorite of the Jason movies, with the exception of 4, which I just think is well done.
Don't forget, Jason Goes to Hell also features a coroner just eating his heart.
Yeah,
like for some reason that scene is just imprinted on my brain. I could not forget it if I wanted to. And I even more than that ridiculous lightning, like that's the scene where I really was like, okay, this is just a comedy now, right? Like we're not really interested in horror anymore. And by the way, it's fine. Like I think it's better to adapt, and at some point you've kind of seen everything, so you just have to up the ante to make it something. Like how many times can you actually be scared by Freddy or Jason?
Yeah, but it's interesting because like with the like 6, I think was the first one. Not I think it was. That was Tom McLaughlin was the writer director of that one. Who was like, this is fun. People like these movies. I'm gonna purposely make it funny. But I don't necessarily think that they meant to make Jason Goes to Hell funny. I think it just was incidentally funny because of how absurd it was. And there are elements of like Jason Takes Manhattan that are funny, but like they're not funny. I think so. This I think like gives into the overall topic, which is like, are things funny on purpose? First of all, do the characters take it seriously, or are they like, is it a winky kind of thing, or are they like deadly serious through it, and it just happens to be funny? Or is it a comedy? And I think that's the difference. Like if the characters kind of feel like they're in a comedy and then there's a scary thing, that to me is much more comedy than horror. And then a funny like event or happenstance within a scary movie. Because there also always needs to be like in even just straight horror movies, there needs to be like the release of tension. That's such a huge part of the horror experience. If it is a relentless horror movie, there are obviously movies that are relentless, like the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or I would even say like something like Hereditary is just like has a relentless kind of air of, at the very least, unsettlingness. And like, sometimes people go, well, that wasn't a fun movie to watch. And that's, but to a lot of people, horror is fun because there's, you get you get the spine tingling nature of horror. And you do have those moments. That's what the cat scare is all about. Like it's, oh my God, something's going to happen. And then a cat jumps out, and it's cheap, but it's also like, it gives people the momentary jolt. And then everybody kind of can go, like, because we thought it was going to be a scary thing, but it was just a cat. Like, that's a necessary part of the horror experience, I think.
So I've thought about this because I've been working on these lists. I've thought about this a lot, about what actually defines, because we're going to get into movies that seem like maybe they should qualify but don't, and why not.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I've kind of landed on is that the reason we call them horror comedies is because they're actually comedies at their core, but if you were to remove all of the intentional humor. And it doesn't mean the characters know it's intentional. You know, like the characters
Right.
often don't know it's funny. That if you just removed it, you just have a pure horror movie. Like I think, but it has to be comedy based versus horror based. And there you can't underestimate how important the horror elements are, because a movie like The Addams Family is not a horror comedy. It's just a straight up comedy.
Mhm.
When you kind of get into these, you know, I feel like for so many horror comedies, people see them and they know that's a horror comedy, right? It's just like, it kind of like, you know it when you see it, and it's very
Mhm.
easy when it's obviously a horror comedy. But I think there's more nuance and gray area around the edges than people realize. For example, Scary Movie, not a horror comedy. That's just a
Yep.
comedy that is a pure parody. But even that could be misleading, because there are lots of great horror comedies that are sort of like parodies. Although I think of them more like as homages or tributes, or
Right.
in the style, you know, like zomcoms, zombie horror comedies tend to do this really well, where they are both tributes, but also, but like a movie like Scary Movie, no one's ever going to confuse that with a horror comedy. It's just a straight up comedy that
Yeah,
is
it's a
making fun of
spoof.
horror movie. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
spoof.
Yeah.
So there are, I feel like 95% of movies that people would put up as horror comedies are very easily defined as a horror comedy. It's the 5% where I think there's some really good debates to be
What
had.
and then what about the other 5%?
Those are the fun ones to debate. That's what we're going to do that. We're going to do that with the people.
Okay.
While they're
You said
driving in their car, they're going to be yelling and in agreement and disagreement.
I would just like everyone to realize that Mikey left out 5%. You said 90 and then you said 5.
No, I said 95%.
Okay. We'll check the tape and then I'll doctor it to make sure I was right. Because I don't remember now. Anyway. Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. So like, what you obviously have made these lists of funnier and scarier versions of horror comedies. So what were your criteria in terms of like how you, and because you and I have like argued a little bit about this too. So like, what were your kind of criteria for both of those?
It's much easier to come up with really funny horror comedies, which I
Mhm.
think is indicative of what I said, that it's a subgenre that is comedy based. So most really good horror comedies excel at the comedy. But there are some that are genuinely creepy. I don't think there are a lot that are really traditionally scary. The way, you know, you mentioned Hereditary, which is a movie we've talked about on this podcast in the past that terrified me and still does. There aren't really horror comedies that kind of reach that level. It kind of can't, because the tension. There's only
Mhm.
so much tension you can build when you're laughing every few minutes, or
Right.
something is amusing, or it's something is clever. Um, but there are certain films that I think really kind of walk that line perfectly, including when we get to the end of this, we'll talk about what I think is the ideal, like the perfect walk the line between horror and comedy movie. It's a very famous one. There's a little tease for the listeners. Um, I did. I think what I found was that the horror comedies that people kind of find scary are ones where there's a lot of body horror, because they are unsettling. They're not comfortable to watch.
Mhm.
And that, you know, one, and I asked in Slack, we have a lot of movie experts and fans, and the one that everybody insisted had to be on the scary list was Slither. And Slither is definitely a horror comedy that I think leans actually a little bit more horror than comedy, which is kind of rare. And what you find is
Mhm.
that people are just really disturbed by the grossness of the movie. So that's one way that you can make a funny movie that's also not pleasant to watch in certain spots, which is how you kind of get to that side.
It's definitely horrific. I don't necessarily think I would agree with that. I would tend to put it more in the comedy side of things, because it's a comedy that where horror things happen instead of a horror movie where funny things happen.
Well, that's the thing about the quote unquote scary list, is that all of them are still funny.
Right.
You know, if they're not funny, if they're not funny, they're not horror comedies, or they're not good movies because they're trying to be funny.
Right.
So, I don't think anybody's going to look over the scary list and be like, this is keeping me up at night, or, oh, that's, for here's an example, without giving too much away. Like, I have the original Gremlins on the scary list. The original Gremlins to me is much funnier than I think it gets credit for sometimes, because people think of it more horror, but to me it's actually a little bit more comedy. But there are really genuinely creepy scenes and sequences and ideas, and the premise is kind of, it's both a little silly but also a little terrifying. So it's not that that movie's not funny. I want to that I had on the list, the Cabin in the Woods. I think is like laugh out loud funny at many points. It's also kind of creepy at many points, and
Sure.
so yeah, you can't. If your horror comedy is not funny, you don't have a good movie, or you don't have a horror comedy. So that's kind of the tricky part there with finding the scary ones, whereas the funny ones those are easy. Settled on, or I settled on 13 for each, 13 spooky number.
Yeah.
You guys get it?
The scariest number.
Ooh, the scariest number. I could have done a list of 25 for the funniest ones. Like, I had to cut out some really good ones. Whereas the scary ones, 13 felt like kind of butting up to the edge of that idea.
Yeah. Okay. I want to just kind of dive into some of the ones that, like, what to you is like the prototypical, like the apex of the funny horror comedy.
I have this is not only one of my favorite movies. This is, I think, one of the greatest horror comedies ever made. Shaun of the Dead.
Sure. Okay.
I think that is in terms of funny, I have it. Spoiler alert! I have it ranked number 1.
Yes.
Although the rankings, I feel, they're all very similar in terms, except for Shaun of the Dead. That was always going to be number 1 for me. I think that what that movie does, it's 100% a zombie movie. It loves and understands zombie movies as well as any zombie movie ever made. It is the meticulous filmmaking, the way that he parallel shots early before the outbreak versus later. It is consistently funny while always being rooted in the zombie genre, in a horror genre. And I think if you are asking for the perfect example of what this subgenre is, it's Shaun of the Dead.
I completely agree. That is my number 1, with I was going to say with a bullet, but there's hardly any gunfire in that movie. But it's and that movie, like, fittingly, that movie just turned 20. Is that right?
Yeah, it came out in 2004.
Ugh.
I know.
I know. Old, but I've watched that movie so many times. This was a movie one of my best friends and I used to make little shorts when we were in college, and we made a zombie movie specifically because of this. Like, I had Red on Me, like all that stuff was on. It was a basically, and another one that we'll talk about was basically the two inspirations for this. So yeah, it's 100%, and it drives me nuts when people call it a parody or a spoof, because it isn't. It is a straight up zombie movie that also happens to be a comedy that knows that it's a zombie movie, and I think that's a really important distinction. And that's true of all Edgar Wright movies. Hot Fuzz is an action movie that is also a silly comedy, and
wait, don't give it away, because we're gonna have we're gonna have a conversation about Hot Fuzz.
I guess we are. Folks, my eyes are rolling, and now they're stuck. And then I think The World's End is maybe the least funny of the three, but it's also a mixture of two things, which is, sci-fi kind of alien invasion movie. Spoilers for that movie. Yeah, I think they completely understand. They understood the assignment. And it was their assignment. And it also, like, shot them all to stardom and everything like that. And that was a period of time when, 2004 was kind of a banner year for the, like, zombie resurgence, because there was that movie and also Zack Snyder / James Gunn's Dawn of the Dead remake. They both came out that same year. And I think that is a huge kind of watershed moment in terms of bringing zombies back to the forefront, or actually to the forefront to begin with, because they weren't. It's not like they were ever the big thing. You know what I mean? Like even during George Romero's heyday, they were like, oh, that's interesting, zombies. You know, um,
And don't forget, the year before was 28 Days Later, which
right?
for those who were not around for that was a moment.
That was a
Like
moment.
that movie really had an impact on what was going on at the time, and I think that, like you said, this is like a real golden era for zombie movies, and Shaun of the Dead is just perfectly timed to capitalize on it.
Yeah, I think it's very much like part of the, like, it is whether people realize it or not, it is a zeitgeist type of movie, or at least became such. And like, you know, people like us who were in college or thereabouts, this was, and it's also a movie about people in their 20s kind of like trying to figure out their life while this crisis is going on. It's weirdly prescient in a lot of ways, because like we all sort of went through, I won't say an apocalypse, but we definitely went through something
Yeah.
the last couple of years, although we were both firmly in our third eyes at that point. Yeah, Shaun of the Dead is absolutely perfect. You will get no arguments from me on its place as both a horror movie and a comedy. But I do think that people need to realize that like the horror aspects of it are, it's not just gore, but like the kind of tragedy inherent to the zombie movie genre. That's all there. The last act is very sad in terms, as well as being, you know, exciting and horrific, and also funny at times too. So like, yeah, I think that's one of my absolute favorite movies of all time.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I actually, it's like a top 5 personal movie for me.
Yeah. Yeah, completely agree. I think the other one, which is the other one that I was talking about that kind of inspired me as a young person, was another horror comedy, which is Evil Dead 2. It's an interesting one because the first Evil Dead people think is a horror comedy. It's not. It's just a horror movie. Whether you think it's funny or not, that's up to you. But that goes hard into, they say it's the ultimate experience in grueling terror, and I do kind of feel like that. It is it's an overwhelming sensory experience, and also very gross and things. And then the third one, Army of Darkness, is just a straight up comedy. Goofy silliness that just happens to have horror in it, I think. And Evil Dead 2 is the one that is both a horror movie and a comedy.
All right, so you, without knowing it, you gave away my big ending, which is that I think Evil Dead 2, Shaun of the Dead is a perfect movie, is a perfect horror comedy. But I think if we were going to try to name which movie best captures the idea of horror and comedy completely intertwined, I think it's Evil Dead 2.
Mm-hmm.
It has the same creepiness of the first film, which is straight up horror. Like there, you might think certain things are funny, but that is not a comedy in any way. It's a horror film. The second movie maintains that while also adding in all of this comedy that the franchise is remembered by.
Yeah.
And I think if we were trying to find, you know, I wanted to be able to talk about both Army of Darkness and Evil Dead 2 on these lists. So Army of Darkness is on the funny list, and Evil Dead 2 is on the scary list, which I think it qualifies. And I think that captures what I was kind of talking about, which is that just because you're on the scary list doesn't mean you're not funny. Because believe me, you know, as you know, Evil Dead 2 is like laugh out loud funny at times.
Absolutely.
It is just, you know, and I wish like I could go back in time and kind of be in the audience when everybody realized what Bruce Campbell was capable of, you know, because like in the first movie, he's just a guy. He's good. Everybody in the first movie is actually really good. Like what those actors do when they're turned into these dead demons is amazing. But when Evil Dead 2 is when he really starts to get going, you know, it's the whole sequence with his hand. Yeah. Where you don't know the difference between this is just an actor pretending his hand is possessed versus like, oh, this guy's hand is actually possessed. It's incredible. So if we had to name the greatest horror comedy ever based on the idea that it needed to be both horror and comedy, it would be Evil Dead 2.
Yeah, totally. I think it's the it is the kind of example of what a horror comedy is, and that it's by no means the first one of the 80s. That movie came out in 1987, but I think it's the one that everything else is judged by, which everything else is judged. You know, there are other movies like Night of the Demons that came out a year or so after, which is kind of in that vein, but like just doesn't quite hit. It's definitely not as funny. Um, uh, and it's just kind of, you know, it's fine. It's one of those kind of like, it's a fine movie, but I think you know, the fact that um Bruce Campbell spends so much of that movie just by himself going insane. um
Which, by the way, is it's actually, if you when you kind of get past the how funny it is, like how funny he is,
yeah.
it's actually quite disturbing.
Yeah, I think one of the scariest parts of that whole movie is when everything in the house starts to come alive and just starts laughing at him, and it's all like distorted, and he does, you know, Sam Raimi will do the kind of like wide angle lens snap zoom into people's faces or things faces, and kind of just like like all that stuff, and Ash starts to like lose his mind and like joins in the laughter and everything like that. Like that is absolutely one of the scariest parts of that movie, and it's also just silly as well, because it's like a lamp is like laughing at him even though it doesn't have any like mouth or anything like that, and it's great. I mean, heavens be, like that is such a good movie. It's been a long time since I watched it, and they get a lot done. I think it's only like an 85-minute movie or something like that. It's quite short. Not as short as Evil Dead 1, of course, but yeah, I think all of those movies are just like, they get in, they get out, they know what they're doing, and
It's
that's
the best. It's the best. Just and when you and I just was rewatching them for this. These movies used to just get into the story.
Yeah.
Like we didn't need all this backstory to know everything about the characters. What mattered was that people were in a situation, and we would learn about them as they experienced the situation, and we saw the choices they made and the reactions to these situations.
Mm-hmm.
Like the original Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2 even more, it just gets right into the story, and then when the story ends, the movie ends.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I feel like if so many of the films from especially like the 80s that people love, like beloved films, if they made them today, there would be 20 needless minutes tacked onto the beginning, slow, just needless exposition, followed by the character sitting around and talking about what just happened at the end for 15 minutes. It's like, no, just get to the, you know, I love this, get to the fireworks factory. Get to the fireworks factory. And then when the fireworks go off, I'm going home. I don't want to hang out. I don't need to see the smoldering ashes. Let's go.
Yeah. The smoldering Ash Williams.
There you go. Ashley Williams.
Ashley. Yeah, I know what his full name is.
It's just a fun name.
Yeah. Yeah, the funny thing, the best part about that first movie, the original one, is that he's the least likely kind of protagonist of that movie. Like it starts out and it's Cheryl's the main character, his sister, and then she gets turned into the first demon, deadite, whatever they want to call it. And then you're like, okay, well, his buddy Scott's going to be like the hero, and then he just leaves. He just straight up leaves and then comes back and is like dying, and then whatever. And so then you're left with Ash, who's just like not at all prepared for this type of situation. And then he gets just this house like turning on him and everything like that. It's a really fascinating kind of like art film almost, the first Evil Dead. And then the second one, because they didn't have the rights to their own movie, which is a crazy thing, they basically did this little truncated beginning, which gets rid of everybody except him and Linda, his girlfriend. And so they kind of redo the beginning a little bit, or the first part. And then he's a little bit like better at doing things. And then by Army of Darkness, he's just a swaggering like a-hole. And that's my least favorite kind of Ash. I like the kind of doofy, like, and I think like the overconfidence like has become part of who Ash is to most people, you know, because at the end of Evil Dead 2, he solders a chainsaw to the stump of his arm, and I think that is one of the coolest things ever. And he says groovy, and I think that's iconic, obviously. But in Army of Darkness, where he's just like, hail to the king, baby, it's like stupid. I do think it's fun. I enjoy it. I'm not going to say I don't enjoy it, but that's my least favorite version of Ash is kind of who he is now going forward. But Evil Dead
And to me, an
2 is
Army of Darkness, that he's great. Like when he has his the evil clone kind of breaks
sure.
off, and it's also like so it's not like he's not funny before that. But to
No.
me, Army of Darkness really takes off when the Army of Darkness shows up, and the
Mhm.
skeletons are maybe the funniest army ever put on screen.
Yeah.
It just the visuals, the way they're written, Army of Darkness is pushing the boundaries of horror comedy because it's real close to being a pure comedy.
Yeah.
I think what helps it, the same with Gremlins too. What helps it is that it's part of a franchise that's already kind of established
Yeah.
as a horror. Evil Dead 2 turns the franchise into a horror comedy franchise. So Army of Darkness just kind of keeps going down that path. I think if it was a standalone movie, we might consider it a pure comedy, but I think it just slides in underneath. And by the way, there are movies on the other side. I'm talking about how horror comedies have to be funny to qualify, but there are some really, really good ones that are pushing the boundary in the opposite direction. Thinking of movies like Tremors, which
Sure.
is definitely a horror comedy, but it gets real close to just being a horror movie with funny elements. And the same with a movie I adore and I've loved since it came out, The Frighteners with Michael J.
Oh,
Fox.
yeah.
That is a horror comedy,
Yeah.
but it's real close to just being a horror movie. And I think that's a big reason why I love it. But it's obviously very funny at points, and it's but there are extremes for both the horror and the comedy and horror comedies, and I think that's what makes it such a great subgenre.
Mhm.
And maybe this is just me. These movies have now been around for so long, and there are so many that it almost feels to me like we could drop the sub and just call it its own genre. I know it doesn't work that way, but there are just so many of them. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Well, I think it's like you obviously The Frighteners was Peter Jackson, and that was the movie he made not right before working on the Lord of the Rings movies, but like pretty close. And for his whole beginning of his career, he just made horror comedies or kind of disturbing comedies. His first movie, Bad Taste, is like it's so low budget, but it's very funny about this weird alien invasion and then like raising the dead and stuff like that. It's so over the top and gory. And then his second movie, Meet the Feebles, is this like grotesque kind of puppet show. Kind of, I don't know if you've ever seen Meet the Feebles.
I have not.
I wouldn't say it's a fun movie to watch, but it is a comedy that has like these horrifying like giant puppets, and that's basically the whole movie. But then if any movie comes close to Evil Dead 2's level of like zaniness and also like over the top horror gore, it's Dead Alive, aka Brain Dead. Which to me feels
might be on the list. Might be on the list.
I'm sure it is. If it's not, then you're a fool. But like basically Evil Dead 2 and Brain Dead are like mirror images of each other, I think, in a lot of ways. Like and there's also just something too, and I'm sure you've noticed it if you've seen any Australian or New Zealand kind of films, genre films specifically, but there's just like this level of there's a pitch that they hit in terms of like the weirdness and like the canted angles and the kind of like wide angle lenses and stuff like that are just like people going like there's like a lot of that in Italian, Australian and New Zealand movies, and I'm not exactly sure where that came from, but it's definitely there in Peter Jackson movies, and you can see that in some like weirdly enough, actually it's not a good movie, but The Howling 3, The Marsupials, which is it like transposes to Australia, and it's just this weird Australian kind of like B horror comedy where everybody turns into like were kangaroos. It's not good. But I love especially the end of Dead Alive, where like this dinner party becomes like an absolute like deluge of disgusting like viscera, and it's not even like real viscera because it's blood and guts and like pus mixed together, and it's like brown. It's this brown viscous stuff, and like at a certain point he's trying to our lead character is trying to run away, and he's slipping on disgusting, like he's on people's blood and stuff, and it's oh man. When's the last time you watched Brain Dead, or have you seen Brain Dead?
A long time, very long time ago. But I remember it in kind of the same way you describe it, which is like it just really just finds like that perfect middle ground.
He's and our lead character, who's the character's name I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll think of it at some point. Basically, the whole premise, if you haven't seen that movie, is that there's this weird Sumatran rat monkey that like when it bites you, like turns people into living dead cannibals, essentially.
Lionel Cosgrove.
Thank you very much, Lionel. And Lionel's overbearing mother gets bitten and then dies, and then he keeps her alive, essentially. Like it's, and then there's like a whole weird subplot about like a baby that is also this weird like birthed disgusting monster creature. But anyway, it ends with this funeral where everybody gets bitten and or just absolutely demolished by these zombies. There's a part where a woman screams and then a zombie's fist punches through the back of her head out of her mouth, and it's all done in one shot, but there's like a like something quickly walks in front of the frame to hide a cut. I love stuff like that. But then at the end, as this house is just a sea of the undead, he comes in with a regular old lawnmower, like a gas powered lawnmower strapped to his back, and like starts it and just like goes at people with the blades going, and then they just of course explode into. It's so fun. It has been a really long time since I watched that. It is one of the grossest movies I've ever seen. There's a lot of pus eating and stuff. It's very gross, but I have a great time with it.
Well, you talking about people getting bitten in a horror comedy remind me. I feel like if we talk about horror comedies for an hour and don't mention one specific movie, we have failed. It's the number one film everybody, when I was said, what would you put on the scary list? Everybody universally, and it was fine because I already had it on the list, An American Werewolf in London.
Sure. Yeah.
Which I do, if we were going to just do a list of the best horror comedies ever.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine this is outside the top 5. It's
I think along with Evil Dead 2 and Shaun, it might be just top 3.
Yeah, and I only say top 5 because I don't. It's a personal favorite. It's a film I saw way too young on basic cable.
Sure.
In fact, I think I saw that movie 100 times before I even realized it was an R-rated movie, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, I didn't see this scene many times growing up. They couldn't put this on channel 38.
Yeah.
But that's. If somebody told me that they are just straight up scared of an American Werewolf in London, I wouldn't fault them.
No,
it is. I mean, the transformation scene alone, if you just watch that scene with no context, you haven't laughed at anything, you haven't, you just put that scene on, it is terrifying.
Yeah.
It's one of the best transformations in film. It kind of makes you hate bad CGI even more when you can see what people could do, with practical effects. I think the scene in the adult film theater where he is seeing all of his victims is like an all-time great movie scene. It the type where like it makes me want to go out and create something just because it's so good. And I just feel like there's no conversation about horror comedies that doesn't include An American Werewolf in London, because it's that good. Like you said, I probably is top 3, and I think there's an argument it could be number 1.
Yeah, I think so. I think what's funny about that one, what's funny especially about it is that it's sort of just guys hanging out kind of funny, and there's actually like some straight up, and it's funny that like the very problematic director John Landis is the one behind it, but like he before that had basically just done comedies, and there are bits in that movie that are so deadpan hilarious, like literally. So like there's the part where the 2 cops go in to talk to Dr. whatever his name is, like the your Van Helsing of the movie basically, and the kind of younger cop is like kind of a buffoon and like knocks over a bunch of things, and everyone is they're all British actors trying to be like straight, the whole time, and they do such a good job that it makes it really funny. And then just like the kind of banter between David Naughton and Griffin Dunn, and Griffin Dunn is the friend who gets killed by the werewolf, and then it kind of visits him in various states of decay. It's so good. Like,
It's
and
so good.
and he's just like, "Hi, David." Like, he's just
Yes,
could
so
not be
matter of
more-
fact. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's something you see a lot in great horror comedies. A lot of just deadpan humor, which is because the characters don't know they're in a comedy, which is really always the best comedies, right? Like, I understand there's meta humor that people really like. It's not my favorite thing, but I just think that the more the characters play it straight, the funnier it is. And it's something that one of the movies on our funny list, Tucker and Dale versus Evil.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in that movie is just playing it like they are in a straight horror film. And because they do, it gets funnier and funnier and funnier every time. So,
Yeah.
and I think no film captures that better than an American Werewolf in London.
Yeah. That's a really great. For a while I was kind of like, I've seen that movie enough times, and then last year that was one of the ones my wife and I always make a spookums list, we call it, of movies that we want to watch.
Say it again. Say it again.
The spookums list.
The spookums list.
Yeah. And then if we got nothing going on that night, my wife will be like, "Want to watch a spookums?" And I'll go, "Yes, I do." So we make this whole list usually of movies that we haven't seen. Or that she's never seen. I've almost seen every single movie ever made. No, that's not true. It's not even close to true.
You've probably seen every Italian movie ever made.
Yeah, probably pretty close. But she I think, has vetoed the watching of Italian horror movies at this point. She's like, "I've seen enough. I don't need to see anymore," which I get. I understand. But anyway, so we watched that last year. And I was just like, no, it's great. It's like as close to a perfect horror movie as you can get, I think. Like, and it is easily far and away the best werewolf movie. There are kind of not that many good werewolf movies. This is another topic entirely, but like, there are only about 6 good werewolf movies. And The Howling which is almost a horror comedy. There are bits of it that are funny, but it's not funny enough to be a horror comedy. It's just a straight up horror movie. That also came out that same year, and as well as this other movie called Wolfen, which is kind of more about metaphysical, kind of like spirit wolves kind of thing. But all 3 of those came out in 1981, which I find really weird.
Kyle, I'm glad you said that, because you just reminded me of something I completely forgot about.
It's great.
I think that there is a horror movie.
I think there is too.
That is not a horror comedy. That is the funniest horror comedy ever made.
Okay.
So let me say that one more time. This is a straight horror movie. It is not in any ways attempting to be a horror comedy. But I think if the director just came out today and said, haha, it was a big gag, this is a horror comedy, it would shoot to the list of the funniest. The Happening by M. Night Shyamalan is legitimately one of the funniest things I have ever seen in my life. That movie is so bad. And anytime it comes on, I will watch it, because I will sit there and argue with myself about whether or not this is intentionally funny. At one point, Mark Wahlberg says, "Just give me a second. I'm a teacher, okay?" Like, the whole world is falling apart. And everyone's turning to this, and I was a high school teacher, I'm not disparaging, turning to this high school science teacher to solve the biggest problem mankind has ever heard. And he just is so overwhelmed. He's like, "Just give me a minute, okay?" And he's doing it in this weird voice. I don't know what's going on in any of that movie. It's impossibly funny from start to finish. Talk about like finding funnier and funnier ways for Freddy to kill people. That movie has some of the funniest deaths ever. Just people lagged out in front of riding mowers. But I don't think it's supposed to be funny. I think it's supposed to be either. It's supposed to be terrifying. It's maybe that, I don't know. Maybe if he said it was a horror comedy, it would instantly stop being funny. But it lives in this nebulous Schrodinger's horror comedy zone, where as long as it's a horror movie, it's the funniest horror movie I've ever seen. If it became a horror comedy, it probably would not be. So
I mean, it's not clearly as like ineptly made as this, but like I feel like it's in the same kind of uncanny valley of movie as The Room, in as much as like once Tommy Wiseau eventually went, oh, people find this funny. Okay, it's always meant to be a comedy, and it's like, nah, I don't think so. I think it's meant to be a melodrama that is just very stupid and funny because of it. And it's the same thing there. Like, you're right. Like, if he comes out and says, this is a funny, this is a spoof of horror movies, we would go, it's not very good. But because it's so deathly serious the whole time, but Betty Buckley says, I saw you eyeing my lemon drink. Like, that's not what anyone says. And he goes, what? No.
No, what? No. I could. Wait, you know, we're just gonna have to bank a laser focus about The Happening. Just
I guess
7-hour episode. Where
I mean, talk about laser focusing. Like, that is we can go minute by minute. There could be the Happening Minute podcast. Steal the premise from the Star Wars Minute. That movie is so bad. And then he went on to make even worse movies.
No, I actually do think The Happening is like potentially because there are movies where, like, low budget movies where they're just having fun and it kind of falls short and it's bad, but it's like, you know, like they were aiming for a C- and they hit a D-. Like, who cares, right?
Right.
This is a major director who had made monster box office movies.
Yes.
Critically acclaimed hits. And this is trying to be an A+, and it's an F-.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's genuinely in the running for the worst movie ever, unless you just go in ready to laugh for 2 hours.
Well, I remember the marketing for that was like, M. Night Shyamalan delivers his first R-rated movie. And it's like, oh, this is going to be so... And then it's just like, oh, it's just people... Like, the threat is immediately nullified once the people actually get... You know what I mean? If they turned into zombies, or even just like The Crazies, which I think is a really underrated Romero movie, and remake too. The remake's good. That is a scarier kind of concept, because it's like, oh my gosh. But it's literally just like, why doesn't the thing just immediately kill them? Do you know what I mean? Like they're running from wind at a certain point, but like the pollen or whatever.
Oh my God.
How do you
running from the
outrun
wind.
the wind?
I've never loved anything worse. It's so stupid.
Yeah.
It's so stupid. Okay, I didn't expect to talk about The Happening, which is good, but there are two movies that we have to talk about.
Great.
One, we already mentioned we disagree on. The other, I have been struggling with this, and I think that my own opinion might be wrong. So which one do you want first?
Let's do the one that we're already disagreeing on.
Okay. I think Hot Fuzz is a horror comedy. You do not.
I do not at all.
You start. I'll tell you what, you start.
Okay, so here's the thing. It has horror elements. I will not say that it doesn't have horror elements. But to me, it is not in the ballpark, because it is so much an action movie and a cop movie specifically. It is a specific reference to the kinds of cop movies that they were making in the 80s, the big excessive cop movie days, where there were kind of horror baddies in these movies. So like Cobra is the example that I gave you. Cobra is a very bad canon movie starring Sylvester Stallone as Marion Cobretti, which is a stupid name. And the bad guys are this cult, and you see them at a certain point, like in a factory that produces lava and sparks, and they're just like clanging axes together. Like, it's this insane, over the top, like kind of cultish thing. And I feel like, you know, obviously, and you mentioned rightly that The Wicker Man was an influence on Hot Fuzz, which parts of it are. It's this little tiny community that has a deep, dark secret kind of running through it. But it's a murder mystery, and often murder mysteries have kind of slasher movie elements and, like, you know, the whodunit aspect. Now, if you to tell me, like, I just don't think it's a horror. I don't think it's ever scary enough or going for scares enough to be a horror movie. It is it is a cop action thriller, and often those in the 80s had kind of almost supernatural style villains as their bad guys.
Okay. Two points for my counter. One, I do think that as much as it is an 80s action cop homage. It is a folk horror story. I know what you're saying, but I do feel like when you have hooded psycho killers, not just murdering people, but doing it in really violent ways, and then it turns out the entire town is in on it. Um, this it kind of not just the Wicker Man. Do you know the movie Race with the Devil?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, like. Do you think that's a horror film, or do you think that because to me this is it's very much kind of the story is very much in that vein, which that's like an action horror movie.
I mean, yeah, I can see what you're saying, but again, like I don't think I think it is, but I don't think it's folk horror-y enough. Now, having seen many more folk horror movies, um, the horror movies kind of have to, the big ending is not a horror movie ending; it's an action movie ending, and so like any bits that are folk horror-y adjacent go away because your main character is a cop who and like the whole the shootout in the supermarket and in the town square and stuff like that, that's all there for action spoof purpose, not spoof, you know what I mean, action movie purposes.
No. And that's, by the way, I think that's actually a very good point. It is almost like it's split into two, right? Like the comedy aspect is based on these 80s action movies, and the horror aspect is based on these folk horror tales. I think what puts it over the edge for me is that it is the second film in a connected, loosely connected trilogy by the same director and the same actors, where the other two are definitely horror comedies. So I think I think that is the final piece of the puzzle to complete that picture, which is that I think that's what he's trying to make here are three very different horror comedies.
I think he's trying to allude to a horror kind of thing, but the whole point of that, of Hot Fuzz, spoilers for Hot Fuzz, is Nicholas Angel thinks that there is some kind of like conspiracy going on. He is correct, but the reason behind it is so stupid that and it completely zaps any of the actual horror out of it, because it's all just, oh, they're messing up our town. And it's just like, it's so mundane and silly, and like they've gone to such extremes for this purpose that's when it ceases to be a horror thing. And yes, there's those elements where like there's the mountain, no, the hound in clad in black, like running, chasing Nicholas Angel around and stuff like that, and saying yarp, and pushing the parapet onto the guy's head and stuff like that, which is easily like the goriest part of the movie.
He does fall into a pit where he finds a bunch of bodies. Sure.
Yeah. I'm not going to say it's not.
Kids included.
Yeah.
Dead kids.
Yeah. But the reason behind it is so stupid. Like,
it's the best. Honestly, if I've thought about this, like certain movies or TV shows you wish you could see for the first time again.
Sure.
Hot Fuzz might be my number one. Because I remember, I go to see it. Shaun of the Dead's one of my favorite movies ever. I go to see it, so the expectations are out of control. And for the first time, I'm like, well, this is good, but it's not Shaun of the Dead. But then when you get the reveal of what's really going on, it is so funny, and everything, like, it's like a slow build for the first hour, and the second hour is one of the best payoffs ever. I did not include, I think you make a very good case, and because you made a very good case, I thought it was on the fence enough, and we had so many entries that we couldn't even, we couldn't even get every movie we wanted to on this list.
Right.
I did not include Hot Fuzz. However, if we were both in total agreement that it is a horror comedy, I would have included it on the list because I think it's that funny.
It's definitely funny. I think it's arguably, like, it's not my favorite in terms of sentimentality, but I think of the three, it might be the best one, like the best actualized kind of, like, it's so big and silly. And as much as I like the World's End, I think it doesn't quite sustain the ending the way that I would have liked, although I do really like it.
I like it more than most people. I actually really love the World's End. It's just not as worried about being as funny. It has some moments that are as funny as anything, but overall it has way less laughs. It's going for it's telling a different type of story.
Mm-hmm.
So that wasn't gonna make the funniest or scariest list, but
No,
I
no,
I
no.
love The World's End a lot more. Okay,
Okay, so
so
let's go with this
okay,
controversial choice of yours that you
Con-
don't even
controversial with myself.
right.
Okay, I have an opinion, and I think my opinion's wrong. So I
Great.
want you to tell me. I do not consider this movie to be a horror comedy. Ghostbusters.
No.
I don't think Ghostbusters is a horror comedy. However, when you look at it, when you look at the specifics
Yeah.
and you take definitions for horror comedies, I can't see why it doesn't qualify. I just in my heart know it's not a horror comedy, even though I would argue that Ghostbusters has at least one sequence that is creepier than most horror comedies. When they when the Walter Peck forces them to shut down, the ghost vault, and they are loosed on the city. They that's a creepy montage. The music
Sure.
is fantastic. People are being attacked. It's not played for comedy at all. It's played for horror. Bless you.
Thank
Played
you.
for horror. Um, and yet I don't know. Like it's something I've seen it described as a supernatural comedy, and that makes way more sense to me than a horror comedy, even if I can't come up with the right words to describe why that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that because like I would never have considered it a horror comedy. I think part of it is that it's I think this is a kind of stretch because I don't even know if I 100% agree with this. But like I think a horror comedy has to be I think most horror movies need to be R-rated. The very few are the horror movies that can succeed without being uh R. I don't want to go through the list and see if I'm wrong, but that's kind of where and that movie is famously PG, even though a ghost gives a blowjob in it. Um, I like that. That's a whole sequence that was clearly cut, and Dan Aykroyd's like, "Well, you got to keep that in," and it's like, I don't know why we need to keep it in. Nah, we should. And it's a dream he's having. And it doesn't make a lick of sense. Why is that in the movie? I'm going to say something controversial because I know everybody loves that movie. I kind of think it is vastly overrated as a film. I loved Ghostbusters when I was a kid, and specifically the real Ghostbusters, the cartoon, and I had all the things, and everything was great about it. But as a grown up, I've watched Ghostbusters, and I don't think it's funny enough or scary enough. I do think it's more scary than funny, honestly. Like I think it's kind of a horror adventure film or a supernatural adventure film or something like that. I don't think it's nearly funny enough to count as a horror comedy, in my opinion. But that said, it is a comedy. Like everybody considers it a comedy. So it's a tough one because I don't know. I wouldn't call it a horror comedy, but I think Ghostbusters is almost indescribable as a film. I think it is so singular, and that's the problem with Ghostbusters 2 is a lesser version of the first one, but then you have the 2016 Ghostbusters, which is unsuccessful because it's only a comedy. And then you have the two Jason Reitman movies, which are unsuccessful because they aren't funny. They're not even trying to be funny.
Barely trying to be Ghostbusters movies.
Yeah. So I think it's a very tough, and the cartoon was definitely both funny and scary. There are some, creatures in the Ghostbusters cartoon from the late 80s that are, or mid 80s, whatever, that are as scary as like any kinder trauma stuff that you'd ever seen. So anyway, that's my take. I agree with you, but I also am even going further than you.
Okay.
I don't think it's either a comedy or a horror movie.
I just want to say before we get any angry letters, I still love Ghostbusters, so that's you're fine.
I know. Look,
yeah,
I know I'm alone on this. I've heard, people who are a little bit older than us, who grew up with it more so than I think. Like, because again, I won't speak for you. I'm a kid of the cartoon more so than the films.
Oh no, it was one of my favorite shows growing up.
Yeah, but people like, other people in our space are like, Ghostbusters is a perfect film. It's like it's a demonstrably imperfect film, and that's kind of what makes it work. But like, it doesn't follow any rules. It is a movie where nothing happens and nobody learns anything. Well, I think nothing happens, but nobody learns anything.
I think one of the reasons I'm struggling with my own Ghostbusters non-horror comedy take is that I kind of feel the same way about Beetlejuice But
I wouldn't put it in there.
but I ultimately landed on the fact that Beetlejuice, by any definition, is a horror comedy. And I think why I ended up finally deciding it is a horror comedy is because it actually does embrace its horrorness at certain points. The end sequence, like when they're having with Adam and Gina Davis, when they're resurrecting the couple with their wedding clothes,
Yeah.
that is not played for comedy at all. There's
No.
like a good like 8-minute sequence there that is just played for horror. I don't think this is going to be one of those things where it's like, how can you say Beetlejuice is a horror comedy but Ghostbusters isn't? Well, people are complicated and we contain multitudes, and what do you want from me? I'm doing the best I can.
Yeah. Eventually, we're none of us perfect, and I will eventually diminish and go into the West and remain Galadriel. So what else do you want from me?
You think you're going? You think you're going to the West?
I mean, I live in California.
All right. I don't know. I can't picture you in Valinor. It doesn't seem like it'd be your jam.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe I haven't really looked at the brochure that much.
Yeah. Well, the problem is we don't really know the alternative, right? It's Valinor. Or you got to just trust Iluvatar. Send you.
I don't know if I would.
Yeah.
I think he's got some good ideas, but I don't know if I 100% believe him. Anyway, what are we talking about?
That's exactly how Numenor fell. Good job.
And look what happened to them. Yeah, I don't know. Like, obviously, both Ghostbusters and Beetlejuice should qualify, and yet in my heart of hearts, I can't personally put either of them on a horror comedy list. They are comedies about horror or horrors about like it's tough. They're tough on there. They're family movies. Can family movies be horror comedies?
That's a great question. I'm not sure.
I don't think. I mean, there's horrific elements certainly in both, and like some of the creatures in either of them are quite scary.
I mean, so basically, what we're saying is like, can an 8-year-old watch an actual horror comedy?
Right.
Probably not.
Probably not. Because I think it's a tone thing. Like, there's a softness to both Ghostbusters and Beetlejuice, by virtue of the fact that they are, even though both of them have elements that I think, and that was just kind of the way in the 80s, honestly, like that there were elements of like, this is a bit too racy or a bit too kind of grim for kids, and yet we somehow think it's fine for kids to go see. Obviously, the 80s was a rough time. That's when the PG-13 rating even began, because at a certain point, it was Gremlins was one of the ones that kind of pushed it, was just like, this is obviously too scary for kids. It shouldn't be PG, but it's not bad enough to be R-rated. And so they came up with this PG-13. But even then, it took a while for it to really catch on. And so both Ghostbusters, which came out the same year as Gremlins, and Beetlejuice, which came out 2 years later, are still PG, straight up PG movies. And it's I really want to, like, I would love to go see a list of like, what were the first like mainstream quote unquote movies that started getting PG-13 ratings like regularly. Now that's all people get rated, like, unless you're like, well, we're going to actively try to get an R rating. Everything else just gets PG-13, because PG is like kind of, and certainly G, like kids movies get PG rated and everything else is PG-13 unless it's a movie with tons of swearing and or sex in it. And then everything else, it's just, it's wild to me how like straight down the line everything is.
But I looked it up. The first movie to get a PG-13 rating, Red Dawn.
Interesting. Okay, sure. That's all. It's very violent. It's a very violent movie. Yeah, I find that really interesting. But yeah, like, and maybe it's because, although this doesn't work too, I'm like really going back and forth on this. But like, here's what I was gonna say, and then I immediately like thought of the rebuttal to this, was that Ghostbusters and Beetlejuice both had kids cartoons, Saturday morning cartoons. So it's like, is that really scary enough to be a horror comedy? But then I was thinking, Toxic Avenger had a cartoon called Toxic Crusaders, and that was straight up for kids. And Swamp Thing was an R-rated movie that had boobs in it, and that kind of, the premise is not really for kids, and yet there was a cartoon for that, very short-lived. And then like RoboCop and Rambo, which are both very R-rated movies, both had cartoons. So I
Yeah,
don't really.
they didn't care in the 80s and into the early 90s. They just turned
Yeah,
anything into a kid's cartoon.
because they got to sell that merch. I remember like there were, there was a whole line of action figures based on aliens. And there was never a cartoon of aliens. There was a comic book and video games.
Those toys were creepy.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, those are scary toys. My friend had all of them.
Yeah, the actual alien toys are like really creepy looking. I had a friend who had a couple. I never did. I'm not even that mad about it. Adam Murray of this parish talked to when I talked about this when he was doing his alien timeline video, which you can find still on Nerdist.com and YouTube. But there was like the commercials for the aliens toys were narrated by Rob Paulsen pretending to be Hicks, not pretending, but playing Hicks. So it's like, here's the colonial Marines out to get to, it's like Ripley, Apone, Hudson, and I'm Hicks. And it's like, no, you're Rob Paulsen.
Nerdist alum.
Yeah, Nerdist alum, Rob Paulsen. Yeah. So anyway, that's where I'm kind of at with those. It's like, because I definitely don't think Beetlejuice is a horror comedy, and yet why isn't it? It's just, it's one of those things. Like, he just doesn't feel it.
I talked out Beetlejuice with other people, and they were all kind of had the same thing, and then landed on yes, even though that's how I felt. Like, so listen, we're not. I don't think Congress is going to call me up to defend
they got other
list choices.
Yeah,
do they? Those fat cats in Washington.
Oh my God! Let's drain that swamp.
But for a little behind the scenes, we put a lot of thought into these lists, which people then get really mad about, as though we didn't consider 100 million things that you haven't even considered.
Yeah,
and it has been fittingly haunting me about how to qualify both Beetlejuice and Ghostbusters. One made the cut, one didn't. It doesn't change the quality of either movie or how much you can enjoy them. So
yeah. Before we wrap up, I do want to. There's a few on my personal list that I wanted to shout out just because I think they're fun. So, Return of the Living Dead, which is a movie that I didn't like for a long time because I was kind of a zombie purist when it came to like Romero rules, and that movie is made by Dan O'Bannon was the director and the writer of it, but it was started as a novel, I believe, by John A. Russo, who was the other half of the Russo Romero production team that made Night of the Living Dead. They each wanted like to be in control of the living dead, and somehow Russo got control of the quote unquote living dead as a phrase, and that's why all of the later Romero movies are all just of the dead, and they're good. But Return of the Living Dead, which spawned a series, none of which are good except the first one, is very funny, but it's also really dark. It has a lot of really like grim things to say about death, like because the zombies themselves don't want to be, they're like, it hurts to be alive, like, and they have to eat brains. That's where them going brains, that's where that comes from. And like one of the main characters is this coroner who you find out was a Nazi, and it's just kind of part of the story, or his backstory. He was there with Mangala kind of like doing weird experiments, so he's like kind of familiar with this type of thing. And there's like a couple of like bumbling idiots at this medical supplies place who are the ones who named Bert and Ernie. No, Bert and Ernie, never mind, those are different characters. Ernie's the Nazi guy, and Bert is Clu Gulager. But the other two guys are the ones who kind of start the whole thing. And it's a disturbing movie. And then you have like punks like who go to this cemetery and get devoured and or changed into zombies and stuff like that. And you get horror scream queen Linnea Quigley dancing around naked on a grave. It's a weird movie, but I think it's fun. I think it's very funny. Another one, Fright Night, which I don't know if you've ever seen Fright Night. The original is pretty funny. It's definitely more horror than comedy, but it's kind of, the idea is that a kid thinks his next door neighbor is a vampire, and then it is. And he goes and gets an aging horror host played by Roddy McDowall to help him out. Um, yeah, it's super fun. 80s kind of funny thing. I guess you could also count like Monster Squad in there, or Night of the Creeps, or other movies like that, which are funny and often scary. Happy Death Day, I think, is a recent one. Happy Death Day 2 is more sci-fi, and then Freaky, which is the like Freaky Friday version of a slasher movie. But Happy Death Day is still the best one. And then Bubba Hotep is the other one I wanted to shout out, which I think is definitely more funny than scary by far. But it's another Bruce Campbell movie where he plays aging Elvis in a retirement home. Yeah, those are my ones.
I don't want to give away all the list. I want people to go to the site and read both. Yep. Those are movies that were all under consideration, that were very close. If anybody thinks I just ignored all of Kyle's suggestions, Kyle has some movies that he strongly recommended that are on the list. The only one I will mention that is on the list, and I just want to mention it because I think it's an example of how you can just do straight horror without intent. Like, you can make something that's horror, but it's so funny unto itself that it is horror comedy, and that is Creepshow.
Sure.
It's definitely on the scary list.
Yes.
And it's not like there are any intentional jokes. It's just that they mine the situation for humor, and the way, the stories themselves are also kind of funny.
Yeah.
Something to Tide You Over and The Crate, I think, are just like, it's a very different type of horror comedy than most of what we've discussed, where even if the people in the story don't know it's supposed to be funny, the people making it do. Whereas Creepshow, you could almost convince yourself that they didn't even realize how funny it was. They obviously did. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
George A. Romero and Stephen King, they know what they're doing there.
Exactly.
But it's that good, and there's really very few things that are on that kind of Creepshow level. So I just wanted to shout that out.
Yeah, that's a great call. I love Creepshow. That's another one that I watch every so often and get really like, oh yeah, this is so good. And like, well, that was made before there was the kind of Tales from the Crypt resurgence, but it was meant to be like, to evoke that kind of EC Comics, where there was like this very strong vein of dark humor in all of those comics, which is sort of missing from the Amicus British films from the early 70s. Amicus made this whole string of portmanteau anthology horror movies, and they made 2 adaptations of EC Comics. One is called Tales from the Crypt, and the other one is called Vault of Horror. And I think Tales from the Crypt is easily the better of the 2 films, but neither of them are very funny. They're very much played down the line in terms of horror, and the kind of situations are kind of like absurdist, and that's kind of the only thing. But Creepshow, I think, bridged, and then later this series that was sort of in that same vein, which was Tales from the Dark Side, were sort of on that vein before Robert Zemeckis, I believe, is the one who spearheaded the TV series on HBO, Tales from the Crypt, which became silly. Like to the like early seasons, I think, are really fun and good, and there's some stuff later on that's really good, but like after a while, it just became kind of a like boils and ghouls, etc.
And Boils and Ghouls, though, still works. Still funny.
It's still funny. Yeah. Anyway. Well, this is great. I think horror comedies are obviously a tough thing to kind of define. You know it when you see it. And also it's like, what do you find scary? What do you find funny? Like, there's both of those are so subjective. It's not like you can watch a drama and go, is this even a drama? Because it's like, of course it is. But like, is like, you watch a comedy and you go, is this even a comedy? I don't, maybe. Like, it's just how they do that a lot more on TV. Like, I don't think The Bear is a comedy. It's funny at times, but I don't think it's a comedy. And yet it won Best Comedy because the Emmys are stupid. Remember how, like, there for a while, this is obvious side tangent. There for a while, like almost year by year, they changed what Orange is the New Black is, whether it was a comedy or a drama.
At this point, I assume every comedy is not really a comedy.
I think you're almost 100% right.
This is a Slack rant I do every few months, which is I'm tired of shows that are supposed to be funny that want to make me cry.
Yeah.
I just want more It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia style shows.
Yeah.
Just, I want to laugh. No more crying. No more drama.
Yeah. Even Ted Lasso, which is more out and out comedy than a lot of them, is still very like cryy kind of like.
That's what it
touching.
became.
Yeah.
That's what it became, you know, and that I don't think there's any surprise the first season's the best because it was comedy that then kind of like surprised you with the drama and, you know, but
yeah. Well, I don't think either of us can disagree that 227 is a comedy about Marla Gibbs and her family. Is that a reference nobody gets? Great. Love it.
I remember that show now that I'm looking at the photo. I forgot it was called 227. I would have just assumed that show was called Jackie.
Jackie, excuse me.
Jackie. I mean, talk about a legend.
Yeah. The reason that is in my head is that there was a, I think, ill-judged sort of attempt because there were a few series comedies, sitcoms on NBC that were for and by and about black audiences or like for black audiences. And so they made like a promo for all of them where there was like a rap and it was so bad. But the 227 part of it is like 227 is a comedy about Marla Gibbs and her family. And that is just in my head forever. So anytime anybody talks about what is or is not a comedy, I always go, well, 227 is a comedy. We know that.
What a fitting way to end a horror comedy podcast because that's gonna now be stuck in some of our listeners' head.
It'll haunt you.
It'll haunt them, but it's also very funny you did that to them.
Yeah. I'm sorry, everyone. Mikey, how can people get a hold of you on the internet? Oh no, you finally took the plunge.
No, I didn't delete my accounts. I just deleted the shortcuts on my phone. However, if you want to find me, I will sporadically check Burger Mike at both Twitter and Blue Sky. But the best place to find me is at the greatest website anybody ever created in the history of the whole wide world, Nerdist.com.
Yes, please follow me on Instagram at Please follow me on Instagram at functional_nerd. Follow me on Letterboxd at Kyle_Anderson. You can follow all of my horror movie watchings, of which there have been many lately, in spooky season. Spookums. Yeah, all the spookums I've been watching. And yeah, thank you all for listening. Join me again next week on Laser Focus when my guest will be a different person. Bye-bye. Laser Focus is a production of Nerdist Industries and Legendary Digital Networks. It was produced, edited, and hosted by me, Kyle Anderson. For more, visit Nerdist.com.